what's up guys? Welcome back for another video. In this video, my goal is to transform these Trex decking boards into something like this. Alright, so these Trex decking boards were actually donated to me by some really awesome people, and my goal is that I want to try to build an Adirondack chair out of it. Now, what I did is I grabbed these build plans from Rockler here, and they have cardboard templates that you can use to trace out for a lot of your pieces, so that makes it pretty easy. They also have some instructions for some of the pieces that don't have cardboard templates, so that you can know exactly what size to cut everything. Now this is going to be a little bit tricky for me using these composite decking boards, because obviously they're not going to be the same size as the dimensional lumber that the build plans will call for. But I think I can figure it out. It might take a little brain power to figure out the different dimensions, but we're going to see if we can get something that looks pretty similar to an Adirondack chair out of all of these boards here. All right, so let's get started. Now, since I only have enough material to make one of these chairs, I simply trace an outline using the provided templates with a Sharpie. Now, I would recommend using one that makes your line a little bit easier to see when it comes time to cutting the pieces out. Also, if you planned on making more than one chair, you could use the cardboard template to make either a plywood or MDF template to make batching out multiple pieces just a little bit easier. Now, I'd say the average size of most of these offcut Trex boards was around 42 inches. So that meant I could really only get one piece out of each board for most of the pieces. However, the main support pieces needed to be a little bit bigger than any of the pieces that I had, so I did order one 16-foot long board from Home Depot for those pieces. And I will say I got kind of a funny look when I went to pick up my order for one single decking board. Apparently these boards only come in 16-foot lengths, so I'm going to do a little bit of on-the-fly cutting. Once I had my longer pieces for the main supports, I repeated the same process of tracing my cardboard template onto the Trex board. Now, because I'm using these composite decking boards that only have one finished side, I needed to make sure that I flipped the cardboard template over when tracing out my second main support, so that I ensure I have a finished side facing outward. Clearly that is not shown in this video footage because, well, I messed up. I guess it's a good thing those Trex boards only came in 16-foot lengths after all, so I had enough material to make another one. Now I had all of my pieces traced out onto the Trex board, so the next step was just to start cutting them out. To do that, I headed outside since I don't currently have dust collection in my shop, and I kind of had a feeling this was going to be a messy job. You'll see just how messy in just a bit. Now, since our work required us to be outside most of the day, I decided it would be a good time to set up Murphy's new pool, so at least he could be cool while I battled heat exhaustion. I'm gonna go out on a limb and say that I think he's a fan of the new pool. With the old rusty dog taken care of, it was finally time to get started cutting out my pieces for the chair. For the main support pieces, I cut close to the trace line with my jigsaw, and then I came in with a sander and tried to sand it to the line exactly. Now, this was one of my complaints with working with this composite decking boards. I just feel like wood is much easier to sand and doesn't make as big of a mess. After a while, I had it pretty close to the outline and could move on to cutting out the rest of the pieces. I cut out the remainder of the pieces on the bandsaw. And after all that cutting, I had a giant mess to clean up. Okay, so now for the parts that don't have templates to trace out, they have some diagrams here that sort of show you what size you need to cut everything to. So this is the diagram for some of the seat slats. So it's telling me that I need to cut it to 1 3/8 inches by 24 inches long for 9 of them, and 2 of them need to be 1 3/8 by 22 3/4. So those are pretty simple. I'll just rip those down on my table saw. Now, because I'm using not regular dimensional lumber, and I've got these composite decking boards that sort of have these grooves here on each side, I'll basically need to rip off that groove on each side, and then once I do that, I should have enough width here to be able to get 3 seat slats per board. So now I just need to rip all that down. Now, at this point, I was starting to complain about how much I was covered in dust from ripping down these composite decking boards, but joke's on me because it was only going to get worse from here. Alright, so I've got all of the pieces cut that I needed to cut on the table saw. Now the next step is I need to go ahead and round over a lot of these pieces with a 1/4 inch round over bit, and then I think I'll be getting pretty close to assembly. So let me go ahead and get my router out and start working on rounding this all over. So the instructions even tell you where you need to round over everything. So as you can see, everything that's lined in blue here means that I want to give that a 1/4 inch round over, whereas if it's not shaded in blue, that means that I don't want to round over that section. So I just need to follow this guide to sort of show me exactly where I need to round over everything. Now this is what you call a dirty job. This is probably the messiest I've ever gotten from rounding over edges with my router, so I decided to call it for the day and get cleaned up, and tomorrow I would work on getting the pieces assembled into something that will hopefully look like an Adirondack chair. Prior to starting assembly of the chair, I wanted to make sure that my main support pieces were as close to matching as I could get them, so I taped the 2 pieces together and ran my sander over them quickly to take down any uneven areas. To start assembly of the chair, I laid my 2 main support pieces out, making sure I had them oriented correctly. Then I took 1 seat slat and placed it between the 2 support pieces and tried to set it up so that the seat slat would overhang each side by about 1/2 inch. To prep the seat slat to be attached, I use a countersink bit on my drill press to drill a hole on each side. Then I attach the first seat slat using 1 5/8 inch screws. I also went ahead and attached the lower back support piece. This piece in combination with the seat slat should help hold everything together for me while I continue assembling the chair. Then it was time to figure out the front legs for the chairs.
Following the instructions, I had one taller outside piece for each leg, and then I had a shorter angled piece that needed to be attached to the taller piece. For the shorter piece, I cut the angle to 15 degrees. This angle is what each of the main supports will sit on, so to get started on attaching these two leg pieces, I'll countersunk some holes and attach the two together with screws. Once I had both of my front legs together, I set the main support structure up on those angled pieces, and then I took some time to get it exactly where it needed to be and make sure everything was square before attaching the legs to the main support structure. Next up was the back supports, and getting these things attached was a little tricky. These pieces had an angle on both ends, and trying to get everything lined up exactly was a bit of a challenge for me. What I ended up doing to get them right is I knew that the angle that I needed to be 70 degrees, so I used my angle finder to make sure that my angle was the same on both ends, and then I did some more measuring to make sure I was pretty close.
Alright, so I just got these back supports here on, and this is one of those situations where using decking boards is a little bit different than if you were using dimensional lumber. It's kind of hard to see the shadow, but you know, this is the finished side here that I cut to that angle, and then let me bring you around to this side. And as you can see on this side, I messed up because one of the things I had to do using this type of material is make sure that I flipped a lot of the pieces so I didn't end up with one of these ugly unfinished sides like I did here. So total screw up on my part. I could cut another piece, but you know, to be honest, I just don't want to. So I'm okay to just live with that since this is just, you know, our personal chair. But if you are going to use these decking boards, just make sure for pieces like this where you've got angles and you can't just copy the same pieces for both, that you make sure to basically reverse that so you don't end up being a dummy like me.
There was also the matter of attaching the top support bracket, and to do that, since there wasn't really any way that I could clamp this together, I just used some duct tape to hold it in place while I got it lined up where it needed to be, and then I sank some screws in through the top. Next, I had to attach the arm support brackets. Now I got these lined up according to the instructions, and then I made sure that the tops were flush when I attached the bracket. To attach these supports, I drilled and screwed some screws in from the inside of the front legs. After getting the support brackets attached, I moved the chair off my workbench onto the floor to attach the remaining pieces. First up was to find the center point for both of my back support pieces. I will need to line up my holes in my back pieces with this center point so that I can attach my first back piece. Once I had the center piece attached, I would just work my way out to each side, attaching each back piece, leaving about a 3/8" gap between each piece. To get my 3/8" gap, I just ended up using a piece of material that I had ripped to 3/8 inches. This helped me keep the gap consistent all the way across. As you can see here, it was clearly time for a quick break, which he takes very seriously. I guess whenever I look like I'm working too hard, he steps in to offer an alternative activity. After a quick break and some encouragement from the foreman, it was back to getting the rest of these pieces attached. Once all the back pieces were attached, I attached a support piece on the back side of them that would help prevent them from twisting. Next up, I attached the back seat slat.
Okay, one problem I'm having with the instructions is I can't seem to find anywhere where they show you exactly what size gap you're supposed to put in between these seat slats here. Now what I've been doing is using these strips that I cut off the ends of my pieces that had these grooves, and these are about 3/8 inches, which I kind of googled to see what is, on average for most of these seat slats. And at least for what I found, it looked like 3/8 inches was kind of the standard. But if I use these and I do go with the 3/8 inch gap between my seat slats, then I don't think I'm gonna have quite enough to fill this space. According to the instructions, I was supposed to cut 9 of one size, 9 of the longer seat slats, and then 2 of the seat slats that were gonna go in here. And then even the 2, I don't think is gonna be enough to fill that gap. So I think what I'm gonna have to do is sort of just play with this a little bit and figure out exactly what size gap I'm gonna need to be able to use all of the pieces that I have rather than have to go cut more seat slats. So I'm gonna just play with it a little bit and kind of figure out that gap so that way I can use all the pieces that I have to kind of fill this space. So I might have a little bit bigger of a gap than standard, but that's the only thing I really know how to do given the instructions and what I have. So let me work on that.
So instead of going with a 3/8 inch gap, I used some scrap 1/2 inch material and made most of the gaps a 1/2 inch. Now in order to use all of the seat slats that I had cut, I did make the shorter pieces have a 3/8 inch gap. Now it would have been ideal to have an even gap across all of the seat slats, but mixing it up allowed me to make it work for this chair. Luckily, the difference in the gap is not enough so that it catches your eye, so I'm sure most people would never even know the gap was not the same. The very last step for this chair was to get the arms attached. Now I held off on attaching the back arm supports until I was ready to attach the arms. I wanted to get it good and lined up and make sure everything was level. So in order to get the arms attached, I first had to attach this back arm support to the chair. I set it up where it needed to be for the arm to be level, and then I sank some screws in from the back side. Then I said a little thank you for getting it right the first try because I didn't want to have to start over. And naturally, I had to test it out and make sure the arms were at optimal beverage holding height. Now when it came time to attaching the arms to the chair, I set them on the support brackets and then adjusted them until I had a similar overhang on each side. Now my arm pieces were a little bit different than the template that was provided because I didn't end up having a board wide enough for the template. I was a little bit worried that they might look goofy, but after seeing them in place, I don't think they look bad at all. Anyways, all that to say that the marked holes on the template wouldn't work for my arms since they were a different size. So I just had to measure and mark where I needed to place my screws, and then once I had them marked, I countersunk some holes and then attached the arms. Now, an extra step that I did that wasn't called for in the build plans was to add a few extra supports to the frame. Since the plans called for some 2x material for the leg pieces and I didn't have that thickness, I thought adding some more supports might help, but honestly, I don't know. This thing felt pretty solid. Now my chair was officially done, but there was one more thing I needed to do. Like a big dummy, I got silver Sharpie on some of my pieces and that was really bugging me, so I wanted to try and get that off. To remove it, I grabbed some steel wool and soaked it in rubbing alcohol, and this actually worked pretty well. So if you ever get Sharpie on something you don't want it on, then I can confirm that this method works. Well, at least on plastic. Alright, now let's talk about the pros and the cons of building this Adirondack chair out of composite decking boards. Let's start with the pros. The most obvious pro for this particular build is that most of this material was salvaged from a dumpster after a recent deck build, so I did not have to spend much money on this chair. Another very important pro to me is that I didn't have to spend a ton of time sanding each of my pieces. Let's be real, sanding can be a chore and time consuming, so I was more than happy to get to skip that step. I also didn't have to spend money or time applying a finish. These Trex boards should hopefully last a really long time and stand up to the weather just fine, unlike most wooden material. Okay, now let's move on to the cons. The biggest con for me with working with this material was just the mess it made. Cutting and sanding this stuff made such a mess. More of a mess than working with wood, in my opinion. Another con is you're kind of limited to the dimensions the decking boards come in, versus if you were working with wood, you would have easier means to adjust those dimensions of the lumber. This wasn't a huge deal because I just changed some of the dimensions the instructions called for, and that seemed to be okay, but it just takes more figuring out. Lastly, my final con is this stuff was tough for me to attach together. Basically, I had to countersink a hole, then drill a pilot hole, and then attach my screw. And I actually broke 3 drill bits in the process. So maybe the assembly was a bit long of a process because of how tough this stuff was, but that's probably just a nitpicky thing. Okay, and finally, I want to talk about the costs for this particular build. The majority of the material was donated to me, so that comes in at a whopping $3.99. So it might be worth finding someone who's redoing their deck and Trex and see if they're willing to donate some of the offcuts. That could save you a lot of money. Or you could buy the Trex boards as well, but they are kind of pricey, and I found that you don't really get a good deal unless you're buying in bulk. Now, I did have to buy one 16-foot long board for the main support pieces, and that was around $100. Now, I only used half of it, so let's call it $50 for that. I also bought one box of exterior screws for $10. And the build plans that I purchased from Rockler were $20. And that's it, guys. That's literally all I spent on this build. Less than $100 for a chair that typically retails for several hundred. That's not too shabby.
Alright guys, I did it. I built an Adirondack chair out of some leftover Trex decking boards. I mean, these things were pulled out of a dumpster. They were destined for a landfill, and instead I was able to make this awesome chair that I'll hopefully be able to enjoy for many years to come.
Wait,
so
you only built one?
Well, yeah.
Where's mine?
Well, looks like I'll be building another one, guys. And that's going to do it for this video. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you guys again real soon for my next video. Bye.